Greetings, and welcome to this series of education modules presented by the Nebraska Court Improvement Project in collaboration with the Nebraska Indian Child Welfare Coalition, also known as NICWIC. Throughout this series, we'll be providing education and resources for improving compliance with and implementation of the Nebraska and Federal Indian Child Welfare Acts, or the ICWAs. We recommend viewing the modules in order and as closely together as possible to gain the most from this series. After you've viewed the series in its entirety, please feel free to watch any section again as questions arise in your ICWA cases. Before we begin this first module, we want to ask you a few questions to determine your current level of knowledge and understanding of the ICWAs, both federal and state. This same test will be administered at the conclusion of all the modules. In addition to the pre- and post-tests, we've included questions specific to the topics in each of the education modules. Before we dive into the ICWA education modules, it's important to discuss terminology. This is a quick guide as reference. However, Native Americans' views will differ for each individual. When a Native person says they prefer a term over another, respect their individual preference. In general, we should refer to a person's tribal affiliation as much as possible. Some Indigenous people prefer the term Indigenous or Native American. However, quite often, it depends on who is saying it. For the purposes of this training, you will hear us say the terms interchangeably. The term Indian can be viewed as derogatory, but is used in nearly all federal and state laws when describing statutory or legal identification, including in the Indian Child Welfare Acts. Governmental agencies also use American Indian, Alaska Native to identify a race or ethnicity category. We've included a terminology chart in the ICWA Resources Guide for further reference. Our roadmap for this first module includes a brief introduction to what the Indian Child Welfare Act is, and we'll be discussing the federal and state laws and regulations in greater detail in later modules. What we want to be sure we convey up front is why the ICWA was passed and why it's still relevant today. Families who are currently involved in the child welfare system still experience historical and intergenerational trauma, and we'll be hearing more about that from people with lived experience. We'll be providing additional resources throughout the module and wrapping things up with some learning check questions. Now let's get started with this very brief introduction to the Indian Child Welfare Act. Then we'll dig deeper into the history behind the federal act.
The United States has a long history of separating Indigenous children from their families and placing them in either boarding schools or non-Native homes, contributing to intergenerational trauma and erasure of Native culture. But in 1978, the Indian Child Welfare Act, ICWA, sought to end this practice by requiring that Native children in the child welfare system be placed with Indigenous families whenever possible to maintain connection to their cultural identity. The U.S. Constitution recognizes Indigenous tribes as sovereign governments with the ability to govern themselves, and ICWA affirms and protects that. This is important because Indigenous tribes are not a racial classification. They are a political designation. In June 2023, ICWA was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court in the case Holland v. Brackeen, which challenged the constitutionality of the act. The Brackeen decision confirmed that there is no resource more vital to the continued existence and integrity of Indian tribes and their children. In his concurring opinion, Justice Neil Gorsuch wrote, "In adopting the Indian Child Welfare Act, Congress exercised that lawful authority to secure the right of Indian parents to raise their families as they please, the right of Indian children to grow in their culture, and the right of Indian communities to resist fading into the twilight of history. All of that is in keeping with the Constitution's original design."
Leading up to the passage of the ICWA in 1978, Congress was presented with evidence indicating that between 25 and 35% of all Native American children were being removed from their homes, families, and tribal communities, most often for no valid reason. The majority of these children were placed in non-Native homes, predominantly with white families. We also know there were some communities, in Alaska and Minnesota, for example, where the rates of removal were much, much higher. In passing the federal ICWA, Congress recognized tribal nations' sovereignty and their interest in protecting their children. To quote the federal ICWA, the purpose of the ICWA is to protect the best interest of Indian children and to promote the stability and security of Indian tribes and families by the establishment of minimum federal standards for the removal of Indian children and placement of such children in homes which will reflect the unique values of Indian culture. 25 United States Code 1902. But before we get into the details of the federal and Nebraska ICWA laws and regulations, we need to understand how the previously attempted cultural genocide led to historical and intergenerational trauma for Native American families and tribal nations. Let's watch a brief video from the University of Minnesota Extension to learn more about what historical trauma is.
What matters in life is not what happens to you, but what you remember and how you remember it.
My dad said when they were growing up, they said, we used to play cowboys and Indians. And he started telling me this story. And we used to fight over, nobody wanted to be the Indian. And he said, I didn't think about that. We'd all play, and I'd always suck it up, and I'd be the Indian. But how ironic is it for a bunch of Indian children to be playing cowboys and Indians, and nobody wants to be the Indian? The introduction of a destruction of culture and loss of what is good. And I asked my dad, well, why didn't anybody want to be the Indian? And I thought I knew the answer. He said, because everybody knows the Indian dies. And that already in his generation, as strong as he was, he received a message as a young child. I received the same message, that it was not good to be Indian.
Slavery, colonization, forced relocation, and other historically traumatic events in generations past have lingering and profound consequences today. But what is historical trauma?
Historical trauma has to do with collective, cumulative emotional wounding over and across generations that results from massive cataclysmic events. These are events that don't just target an individual, but they target a whole collective community. Things like forced relocation from traditional homelands, like the Trail of Tears, like my ancestors went through. But the process that our communities talk a lot about is that the trauma is held personally, and it can be transmitted over generations. So even family members who have not had a direct experience of the trauma itself can feel the effects of that event generations later.
Does historical trauma only affect certain groups of people?
What really helps me to help people understand the notion of historical trauma is that it's actually a phenomenon that lots of communities, indigenous communities, or people all over the world have sort of kind of struggled with. It's not something that specifically is only owned by tribal people or indigenous people. It gets articulated all over the world.
Historical trauma is widespread, affecting many communities across the globe.
Observation has, from the empirical side, started with work on the Holocaust survivors. And there's a lot of work on intergenerational transmission of trauma. And it's moved into also looking at Japanese internment survivors, Armenian survivors, descendants of their Holocaust, and so forth. So there's been some more empirical work in this area. And you can imagine trying to track trauma over generations and trying to tease out what is the impact over generations on this child, combined with whatever traumatic events they've gone through in their childhood and their life.
Some people today believe these events happened a long time ago and shouldn't still have an effect on Native American families. But historical trauma creates trauma, and more trauma. Today, Indigenous peoples have the highest rates of suicide, mental health problems, substance abuse issues, domestic violence, poverty, and many other social issues. We are merely treating the symptoms of historical trauma through the various systems and services being provided to Native families. We're going to continue to view videos and listen to podcasts throughout this series of ICWA education modules. Hearing from people with lived experience is the best way to begin to understand why the passing of the Indian Child Welfare Act was so critical to the survival of Native families and tribal nations within the United States. Boarding schools and the Indian Adoption Project both ultimately led to identifying the necessity of stopping the unwarranted removal of Native children from their homes and communities. Our first video is only a portion of the original documentary, The Wellbriety Movement Journey to Forgiveness. We highly encourage you to view the documentary in its entirety online. A link to the full documentary available on YouTube is included in the ICWA Resources Guide.
A long time ago, before you were born, the old people told a story about a visit from the wisdom keepers. The wisdom keepers told us the light-skins are coming, and their numbers would be great. They will bring great destruction and confusion, that we will go through a time of testing. They will bring 4 mind changers to make us forget our ways. The mind changers would be a liquid, a black book, a song, and a card. They will take your land. They will poison the earth. They will bring disease and sickness. They will kill the women and the children. They will destroy our culture. Only our spirituality will be left. After the testing time, a great healing will take place. The eagles will come back. The buffalo will come back. We will come back. The prophecies will come true. We are now in the time of the fulfillment of prophecy. The story that happened has never been told. Now is the time to tell the story.
Genocide tactics, as defined by the United Nations. Number 1. Killing members of the group. An example of that would be the Wounded Knee Massacre. Number 2. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. A good example of that would be the 1862 mass hanging. Number 3. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, in whole or in part. A good example of that would be the longest walk made by the Navajo Nation or the Cherokee Trail of Tears. Number 3. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. The United States government sponsored sterilization of Native American women. Number 4. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. In 1879, in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, the first of 500 boarding schools. It happened here in the United States of America. Some of the genocide tactics included massacres, forced relocations, sterilizations of women, boarding schools. California alone paid $12 million on Indian bounties. After the atrocities, only about 1% of the native population remained, making this perhaps the largest genocide of the 20th century. Genocide was sanctioned under 24 U.S. presidents from 1830 to 1933. Manifest Destiny, a term that was coined in 1839 and revised in 1845 to sanction the colonization of North America. It was used to designate the belief that the United States was destined, even divinely ordained, to expand across the North American continent. Thousands were murdered and relocated in the name of Manifest Destiny. By 1920, 99% of all Native Americans were wiped out. In 1879, the U.S. government implemented the genocide tactic of removing the children from their native culture and placing them in one of the 500 new boarding schools. This was an attempt to eradicate the Native American culture and assimilate those children into European culture. In 2008, a gathering took place in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The purpose of this gathering was to talk about intergenerational trauma. The pain and hurt at this conference was so intense that the elders instructed us to make a 7,000-mile journey across the United States. We traveled to current and former boarding schools to gather these stories from the people who attended when they were children. We recorded the stories of what happened to them. Here are their stories.
The stories that we heard on this journey from these elders were so unbelievable. Some of the elders, they even had a very difficult time even talking about what went on there. Many of the elders who told the stories of what happened to them was the first time that they ever told a story to anybody, even their children, their spouses. No one had known the experiences that they had in these boarding schools as children.
Said he liked this boarding school. Well, I, for one, hated the damn place. And I can start out with, I don't know if anybody here remembers their life when they were 6 years old. I do. It was right here at this boarding school that I'm going to mention that name, Mr. Care. Boy, did I hate that son of... I mean, really, really hate. And I didn't know I was supposed to ask this man for permission. I'd come back that evening and then he knocked the hell right out of me. There's a window there. He'd shut it, make sure nobody saw it. And when I got back, damn, he just whipped me all over my damn body. I mean, he knocked the hell right out of me. And neither one of us knew how to cry because we weren't supposed to cry.
It is said, "The truth shall set you free." The stories we heard on the journey of the beatings of the children for speaking their language, the violence to the children, the punishment system, the sexual abuse is directly tied to our current day community issues of alcoholism, drug abuse, violence, and sexual abuse. This is called intergenerational trauma.
Because this happened over 100 years ago, 130 years ago, and that historical trauma passes on from generation to generation. And we see many angry young people and others who don't even know why they're angry. And if we look back, we're treating the symptoms, but if we look back, we'll find the root causes go back to this time. When genocide took place.
I remember me and my friend, another girl, well, she was my relative from Cheyenne River. We were in the dormitory and we went out the back door, and it was the roof, and we didn't realize it was the roof, but we went back in, and that night we had, they called our names. They called a whole bunch of little girls' names, and so we all got in line, and the sister opened this door, and she took one little girl in there, and pretty soon that little girl was just crying, and she came out, and then the next one, and we realized they were getting whipped in there. And when it was my turn to go up there, and I went in there, and that sister told me that I was on the roof and I was somewhere I weren't supposed to be, and so they pulled our pants down, and that was our first whipping. The first day I got there, the first night, that was my experience with the first day at boarding school.
I'm the last of the family of 9 children. My oldest brother went to boarding school, never came back. Only his body was brought back. And I had 2 other sisters, later years, lost their lives to alcoholism. I come from a family of alcoholism.
And yes, there was sexual abuse in our time. Yes, there was. But we weren't allowed to talk about it. We were given cod liver oil by the tablespoonful for talking Indian. We were slapped with yardsticks for talking Indian, for whispering, or wanting to go to church. We couldn't have a best friend. They'd break us apart. Like someone said, they got separated because they were too close. And that's the way it was. And that's the way it was in boarding school.
As soon as we got to the school, they cut our braids off. They didn't even have the courtesy to unbraid it. They just chopped them off.
But with the Lakotas, if you cut their hair, it means mourning for them. And for these children, they had to have their hair cut. And it is said that they cried throughout the night over this. That was very smart on the teachers and Pratt in the beginning of the brainwashing that they did to these children. Their whole thing was to totally take away their identity. They changed their names from their native names, which for all of us, it symbolizes our heritage, our pride, our accomplishments. It says who we are and where we stand. And they decided to take all the Indian names away and give them common American names to take their self-worth and their self-identity away from them. That was just part of the brainwashing that they did to the children here. Besides cutting their hair. When the children were caught speaking their language, they were brutally beaten. There's a house over here that they call the Ashburn House. And there's the Ashburn House and the Pratt House. One of those houses used to be the discipline house, and the other one was their mess hall. The stuff that they did to these children was unbelievable. They sexually abused them, they mentally abused them, and they physically abused them. And even better, they would get the native kids to determine what punishment they would get. And if the children did not give a good enough punishment, then the ones that were asked to give the punishment also got punished. And the punishments were quite immense. And to have a house specifically just for that, you could just imagine what happened in there.
my grandfather's in 1898. I have pictures of him at the Fort Taunton boarding school in North Dakota. I called up Fort Taunton, it's now a historical site, and I asked them if they would take me through the school, through the site, because the elders that I was interviewing there were talking about a dungeon, a basement that they were thrown into. And one of my friends, Judy Kakinawash, Flying Eagle from up home, said her father was thrown down there for speaking English, and her father would just sing Indian Ojibwe Sundance songs at the top of his lungs when he was put in there. So they knew that it was under the boys' dorm, and sure enough, there was a door that was locked that the park people took me down, and we had a flashlight. It's a huge basement down there, huge, thick boulders that are underneath Fort Taunton. The fort can fall down, the bricks are crumbling, but that basement will be there forever. And it was just by luck that we found this dungeon. It was this room that was described to me by the elders, because when they made it a newer school, not the boarding school, but a newer school in like the 70s and 80s, they had to put water pipes in. And so they had to bust out some of the huge walls down there to put the water pipes in through the ground. And we saw one that had a hole in it, and we couldn't see what was behind it, so we got a ladder and we put a flashlight in there and looked in there. And we could see that there was sort of a half ladder coming down from the top of the floor. So it's to take me to where that's above there. And it was what would have been the headmaster's bathroom, and there was a trap door, and that's where the kids were thrown down, because there was no light there. The other rooms that were down there had little tiny windows to the outside, but they had bars over them, but there was light. I said, no, they all described a very dark room where there was no light at all. So my auntie that was there, she wouldn't come with me into the school. The elders, many elders want it razed. They want it destroyed because of the horror stories there.
Then when they'd bring the Paiutes up for their haircuts, we'd all be deloused again. They had to bounce a quarter or a dime on our bed. We had to learn how to make our bed. We had to wear shoes and socks they gave us, took our moccasins away. Levi moccasins, our canvas moccasins we had, because we didn't wear shoes at Celilo.
Now that we're going back to our ways, and it's real, because there's this thing called Lakota Dakota Language Summit thing, and in our tribe it's ran. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm not saying any of this is bad, but before you go forth and do stuff, you need to acknowledge those people that suffered away from those agencies that kept that stuff alive, way underground. Before you can go forth and, act like you know everything about the culture, you need to go back and honor those people and say sorry, because they really did. They really did suffer and starve to keep those ways alive.
Who did what they did because they were brainwashed. That I forgive you. But to the United States government, I'm not there yet. But I'll say this to you, the way I started, is I'm not brainwashed and I'm not defeated. I hope.
And my sister went too, but one of the things that my sister just talked about in the last couple of weeks is that every night before she went to bed, she would always hear screams from the boys' side of the boarding school.
Now that we have a brief context of the boarding school era, let's listen to people who discovered our government's tragic legacy of continuing to remove Native children under the Indian Adoption Project and how the federal ICWA came to be. This podcast can be found online by searching Radiolab More Perfect Adoptive Couple versus Baby Girl, produced by Radiolab and WNYC Studios. The full podcast dispels the inaccuracies reported in our media about the Baby Veronica case that was heard and decided by the United States Supreme Court in 2013. The portion we'll hear today dives into the circumstances surrounding the discovery of the Indian Adoption Project leading to the passage of the federal ICWA.
To this guy.
Bert Hirsch. I'm a lawyer.
He lives in Long Island now, which is where I visited him. But in 1967...
The fall of 67, I was on the staff of the Association on American Indian Affairs.
Sort of a legal advocacy group for American Indians. And he traveled all over, working with different tribes.
And
one day, he gets a phone call from this guy, Louis Goodhouse.
The tribal chair of the Devil's Lake Sioux tribe in North Dakota.
And this guy says, I really need your help.
He said there's a child.
A Devil's Lake kid, one of ours, that was just abruptly taken away by social workers.
The Benson County, North Dakota Social Services Agency came in, and they took little Ivan Brown away from his grandmother.
He was 6. What was their stated reason for taking Ivan away?
Neglect.
Because what? Because grandma wasn't around?
No, actually, Bert says that the social workers were looking for that classic nuclear family.
Biological mother, biological father, children.
So when they saw him with an older relative, but no mom or dad, they thought, uh-oh, and they took him away.
The tribal council was extremely upset by this. They wanted to fight a battle about this.
Bert took the case, fought it in court.
We won that case, by the way. Mrs. Alex Fournier, she got Ivan back after a somewhat protracted battle.
But he began to wonder, how widespread is this?
So from 67 to the end of 68 into 69.
He visited
tribe after tribe after tribe,
doing interviews. And he says that everywhere he went, he would hear these stories.
I remember it vividly.
This is Deb Wells. She's a member of the Rosebud Sioux tribe. And when she was 10 years old, a car pulled into her driveway.
Somebody come driving in, social workers, and they got out of the car. And I told my brothers and sisters, I said, go hide. And they had to drag us out from underneath the bed because we got around and got in the house. So then they took us to Scotts Bluff and put us in a foster home. It was horrible.
This was just part of every Native family's history.
This is Marla Jean Big Boy. She grew up on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota.
I remember when I was young, we'd go to one of the border towns, and my grandma would say, stay in the car, lock yourself in, don't get out of the car. I'm going into the trading post because they're going to steal you.
Really?
Yeah.
What we found is that on every reservation...
My name is Michael Evan Nohart. I'm a full-blood Umpapa Lakota from Standing Rock Sioux Reservation.
You couldn't not find a family that didn't know of a child in placement.
The social services came and took me and my sister and told my mother and dad that they were taking us into Mobridge for a physical checkup, and they never brought us back.
Wow. Michael says that his dad spent the next 30 years looking for him. In any case, Bert would ask these people that he was interviewing, what reason did the social workers give you for taking the child? And the answers that he got ran the gamut.
Conditions of poverty, alcoholism,
overcrowding.
Maybe they don't have adequate ventilation in the house.
No indoor plumbing. But in most cases, he says, the reasons wouldn't have stood up in court.
They would put papers in front of them and they would sign. They didn't know what they were signing.
Some families,
if they could, they tried to fight it.
But they usually couldn't afford to.
You know, look, the tribal people are poor. So we began to do a statistical collection of data, state by state.
Asking how many Indian kids are in foster care.
Foster care and adoptive placement and institutional placement, juvenile facilities.
And what he arrived at the end of that analysis is a pretty shocking number.
About 1/3 of Indian children were in out-of-home placements in non-Indian settings.
Wow. 1/3?
25 to 35% of Indian children nationwide were in out-of-home placements.
That's a real number?
That is the real number. That's the number you see cited again and again.
Nobody connected the dots. Everybody thought that it was their own personal tragedy. Nobody realized that this was a pattern and a practice that was decimating these tribes.
Wait a second. How would this happen on this scale? I mean, like, is this just a bunch of social workers making the same decision independently, or is it like a policy?
Well, this is basically social workers very much acting in the spirit of the day, because you have to keep in mind that in the 50s and 60s, you have all these government policies that are put in place whose entire purpose is basically to try to once and for all solve this Indian problem that's gone on and on. You've got this guy in 1953 who's a senator from Utah who starts basically trying to terminate the tribes.
You mean like take away their sovereignty?
Yeah, he goes tribe to tribe trying to convince them or force them, tell them there's no way out of it. He argues that this will be best for all of them.
I remember this. This was like out of E pluribus unum, like to integrate them into the whole.
They will melt into the wider culture. That's what will save them. Part of the social workers that were working in this period, they were working under the auspices of this thing called the Indian Adoption Project, which was very much about that idea of like, you take these kids from their poor conditions and you connect them directly to white families that are looking to adopt.
So part of this was definitely top down.
Very much. In any case, the end result of this is that a third of these kids are being taken away.
There were literally communities where there were no children.
That's Terry Cross. He's the executive director of the National Indian Child Welfare Association.
In Minnesota, there were communities where there were no children. In Alaska, there were communities where there were no children.
I mean, what is a culture except, the ideas and traditions that you pass on to your kids?
That's Marcia Zug again.
If you are hemorrhaging your children, then you're going to disappear.
So what do you do?
Well, it's too massive a problem if you're trying to fight all these removals of kids on a case-by-case basis. Forget about it. A national law is needed.
So Bert spent years
walking the halls of Congress, literally.
Endless lobbying, congressional hearings, until finally.
The Indian Child Welfare Act is passed by Congress in 1978.
So it does a lot, but basically when it comes to adoptions,
ICWA has placement preferences. So the first preference would be with the immediate family. So you're removed from mom, you're placed with dad, or maybe with grandmother.
If they say no?
Second preference would be someone else in the tribe. And the third is any other American Indian.
Wow.
Any other?
Yeah.
And then after that, then the child could be placed with, another family.
Well, so if you're white and you're trying to adopt an Indian kid, you have a lot of roadblocks.
Yes.
But by and large, most of us think that ICWA was probably the best federal Indian law ever passed. It did the most to help Indian tribes, respect tribal sovereignty, and really fulfill the United States' trust relationship with American Indian people.
We sincerely hope the video and podcast clips have given you some food for thought, and that you'll look them up to view and listen to in their entirety. We'd also like you to look for another YouTube video on the ICWA Resources Guide entitled How the U.S. Stole Thousands of Native American Children for more context. But now, let's hear from someone in our own backyard. In an effort to help make these education modules more interesting and meaningful to Nebraska, Nebraska CIP and NCWIC collaborated with colleagues throughout the state to record brief interviews. Let's listen to Grace Johnson, who is Lakota and a member of the Oglala Sioux tribe. Grace is a licensed mental health and substance abuse therapist who has worked with the Omaha tribe, the Santee Sioux Nation, Society of Care, and the Indian Center in Lincoln. She has her own private practice, Red Nation Healing, and currently serves on the NCWIC Board of Directors. Grace has a wealth of knowledge about historical and intergenerational trauma and traditional Oglala parenting and family organization. She's also an avid TikToker about all things Native, so check her out if you TikTok.
So there was, during the civil rights era, Native issues became prominent also due to activism from Native American activists, and the realization that there was so much of a Native, a quarter of a generation being lost, and it was it was actually detrimental to the continuation of a tribe as an entity. We were losing our members, and there was no way we could prevent that from happening. So through the civil rights era, there was, and I forget the name of I think it was Turtle Mountain. I am not sure if it was Turtle Mountain, but it was one of the tribes who decided, it was in Minnesota, to find out what was going on, and they began to interview families, and they found out at least one family in every community had a child that was adopted out that didn't need to be. And so legislation was drafted and brought up to prevent that from happening, to make sure we could keep our community members with us, our children with us, so we can continue on with the culture. And this was coincided with the Indian Religious Freedom Act, which up until that point, up until 1978, our religious cultural belief systems were literally outlawed, along with our languages. And there was a whole push in American society, American government, to continually try to civilize and integrate Native families and people into American society, which we didn't want to be. And this was forced on us through boarding school era, starting in 18. And from then on, it was just policy after policy that really set up Native families to be dismantled, set up our governing style, our tribes, culture, everything you name it, to be dismantled. And it just wasn't known about because nobody talked about it. It wasn't taught in history books. This information you had to go and find on your own. You had to do the research. It was a really coordinated effort on the government to take apart our communities. And there's so much more involved in that. Because when you have what we call the boarding school system, that system was specifically designed to take apart our culture, to stop the transference of cultural knowledge from one generation to another. The quote was, "Kill the Indian, save the man." And it did. It was very hugely psychologically, emotionally, mentally, physically, sexually abusive in all these boarding schools. And it did a good job of interrupting cultural knowledge being passed down from one generation to the next. And this is where a lot of our trauma entered into our families, because it was done specifically targeted to children. In the boarding schools, they started taking them into these schools at age 5. And that in and of itself is, from a developmental stage, can be very damaging just psychologically, because your identity is forming then, your attachment system is forming, and that impacts everything from a person from then on for the rest of their life. So having them go in at boarding school at age 5 was probably the worst time you could have any child be separated from their parent. Today we talk about boarding schools, but we would never consider sending a 5-year-old into a boarding school. And this was being done across the board for all tribes. And this is one completely shared history that tribes have. Even though we come from different cultures, different regions of the United States, different languages, belief system, the boarding schools is one of the shared history that all Native tribes have. The historical trauma aspect of this is just, it's a part of the whole boarding schools. It's a part of the Indian Child Welfare Act. And we know today now that trauma is passed down genetically. It is inherited because of what a mother has gone through and possibly grandparents. And so it affects the gene expression. It affects how the genes are expressed. And so the more I learned about intergenerational trauma and the more I learned about ACEs, I began to say, this is what tribes went through. This is everything our tribes experienced, our children experienced, just by going through the boarding school system. And so the intergenerational trauma is what we're seeing today. You see it in the parenting we have today. You see it in the lack of parenting. You see it in the high domestic violence rates. You see it in the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls Two-Spirit issue we have. You see it in the addiction rates, the high suicide rates. So it all ties together, but it's so large, and it happened over decades, over 100 years, that if you don't step back and look at it from a larger picture, you're not going to understand why there's so much problems in Native families. It is. Great white savior is a thing. They think they knew better than us. And what I talked about earlier, comparing Maslow's hierarchy of needs, our parenting styles, our community style. Actually, we knew better. We had a system that worked really, really well. It's just that people were coming in who didn't understand that system and thought they could do better. And they couldn't. I mean, we have what we have today because they thought they could do better. It's infuriating because now we have high suicide rates and you name it, we have all kinds of disparities.
As you've just heard, the Federal Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA, was passed by Congress in 1978 in response to concerns that Indian children were disproportionately removed from their homes and tribal communities. The majority of these children were placed in non-Indian foster or adoptive homes and institutions, often for reasons that would not have stood up in court. And despite federal challenges to the constitutionality of the ICWA, this is not a race-based law. The law is based on the political status of tribes as sovereign nations within the United States. In Nebraska, we have a state ICWA statute that provides strengthened protections for Native children and families, which we'll discuss further in later modules.
Remember me, when the sun comes up in the morning sky, there I will be, soaring with the eagle so high, feeling free. Remember me.
As we wrap up this first education module, we want to share the Capacity Building Center for Tribes' great resource on historical and intergenerational trauma that's linked on the ICWA Resources Guide. We encourage you to check out the resources on their website and subscribe to receive email updates from them. Next, we'll wrap up this first education module with a few learning check questions. See you in Module 2 very soon.
Remember me, when the sun comes up in the morning sky, there I will be, soaring with the eagle so high, feeling free. Remember me, down the road, hand in hand, you and me. Hey-oh.
Hey-oh,
Hey, we are hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, we are hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, we are hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh. Remember me. When the sun comes up in the morning sky, there I will be, soaring with the I go so high, feeling free, remembering